today we're going to give a brief overview of the context behind European colonization, right? 1492, Columbus sails the ocean blue. What led up to that? Why was he doing this? We're going to go back 40 years to 1453 with the fall of Constantinople. Now, maybe you have heard that Constantinople is now Istanbul, but it used to be the Roman Empire, right? So in 476, Goths and whatever barbarians come, they take Rome, and boom, Roman Empire's gone. So we think, but actually the eastern half of the Western Roman Empire centered in Rome. This is the Western Roman Empire that collapses in 476. 1,000 years later, Constantinople, which is right here, it finally falls. And this is the kind of the end of the idea of the Roman Empire. Now, Constantinople is super important for a number of reasons. One is that it is the furthest east of Christian Europe, right? That is the Christian fortress against the non-Christian barbarians of the East. But also, if you look at the geography of Constantinople or Istanbul, it's this incredibly important strategic zone. It's remarkable that this exists geographically, that the Black Sea empties through the Bosporus Straits, which is where Constantinople sits. The city itself is on both sides of this tiny strait, which is at its narrowest, less than a mile wide. And so Constantinople sits at the crossroads of European and Asian trade. It's incredibly important strategically. And so in 1453, when Mehmet II takes down the walls of Constantinople, which have stayed strong for about 1,000 years, Mehmet II is the first one to really bring gunpowder to major sieges. And these are massive cannons, like 20 feet long. They're only able to fire 8 times a day, but over the course of months, he's able to batter down these walls built by, I think Justinian, but I'm not entirely sure, by a Byzantine emperor in the 500s, so about 900 years earlier. What happens when the Turks under Mehmet II, these are the Ottoman Turks who last until 1918 after World War I, what happens after Mehmet II conquers Constantinople is he ends the trade through Constantinople to Europe, right? So the Silk Road, which goes from China all the way to Europe, is now severed. And this means that Europeans cannot get access to silks, porcelain, all these fine things, but especially spices. Now imagine if all the food that you had no spices, right? Let's take some beef and let's throw it in a pot and we're going to boil it and then you're going to eat it. And no, there's no salt, there's no pepper, there's no cumin, there's no nothing good. It tastes terrible. So this is a major problem, right? If you're eating 3 meals a day and it's all bad, we got to figure out another way to eat something tasty, right? So people immediately start looking for other ways to get to the east, the Indies, what is now modern day Indonesia and Malaysia. This is where most of the world's spices came from. Okay, we're going to fast forward about 40 years to 1492. Finally, Columbus. Wait, not yet. In 1492, there's a number of things that happened, especially in Spain. So in 711, the Muslim armies that had previously conquered just an incredible swath of territory, right? Muhammad kind of invents Islam in the 600s, and his armies then stretch from Pakistan all the way to Morocco in this area, creating a massive Islamic caliphate or empire. In 711, in the next century, they cross the Straits of Gibraltar and take over Spain. This is the Muslim conquest, and for the next 700 years, the Christians who had lived in Spain beforehand are involved in the reconquest or the Reconquista, right? In 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella, the Catholic monarchs, finally push into Granada, which is the southernmost province, and they expel the Muslims once and for all. So you have this Spanish kingdom that is forged through holy crusade against non-Christian peoples. They are involved in converting the population forcibly if necessary. One of the moments after the conquest of Granada is they expel all the Jews. So all the Jews who had been living under this Islamic caliphate are now banished. And this is a tremendous moment in Jewish history. But beyond that, they have this system of creating outposts of Spanish culture, of Spanish religion, to ensure that the population belongs to the greater Spanish kingdom. And more importantly than the Spanish kingdom is Catholicism, right? So you have this backbone of conquest and conversion that is going to set the scene for a lot of future relationships between the Spanish and the Native Americans, which we'll get to in a second. All right, so this comes together. In 1492, Columbus has been looking to a number of different princes and kings saying, hey, will anyone fund me to go to the Indies? And everyone's like, no, why would we do that? And it's not because everyone thinks the world is flat, which a lot of people believe is the reason, but instead it's because everyone's like, the world is 26,000 miles in circumference. And Columbus is like, nah, bro, it's like 16,000. It's going to be super easy. It's just on the other side, right? All I need to do is leave Portugal and sail for a month and then I'll be there, right? Yay. That's not the case, right? It was 1,500 years before this that a Greek mathematician found out the circumference of the Earth by basically calculating the angle between where he was in Alexandria and the sun, and then he paid someone to literally just walk and count their steps with and be as precise as possible. And I think it was like 250,000 steps. He went that far, and then they measured the angle again. And through trigonometry, which you guys should all know, that's how they calculated. So you get the angle. You know what proportion of a circle that radius is between the sun going to one place and the sun going to another place, and then they map that out. So he was actually very, very close to the actual circumference of the Earth. But Columbus was like, no, I actually know better than him, and he set out. And he found a good audience in Ferdinand and Isabella, who, after the Reconquest, said, hey, we got a lot of money and we want more glory, right? We're coming off this high, let's keep going, right? And so they outfitted Columbus with 3 ships and a bunch of convicts, because those were like the only people who would join him on a suicide mission, and they set sail. And if Columbus had been, if the Americas had not existed, Columbus would have died, and no one would have ever heard of him, and the entire ship's crew would have starved to death in the middle of the Atlantic/Pacific Ocean. But luckily for him, the Americas existed, and he landed in modern-day Hispaniola, which is the Haiti and Dominican Republic, the one island with both countries. All right. So he discovers the Americas for the Europeans, the first European to set sail, to set foot in the Americas since the Vikings in about 1000 AD. He was remarkably brutal when he showed up. He saw that the Taino were docile, they were friendly, and he wanted to exploit this, especially when he saw them wearing gold jewelry. And so this elicited a greediness in him, so that he began to enslave the Taino. He compelled them or coerced them to find more gold and precious metals for him. And he did this by killing the people's families, holding their families or their children hostage. He would famously chop off the hands or the feet of people who were not able to meet his monthly gold quota. And within a few decades, the Taino population of Hispaniola went from 300,000 to 50,000. Many of them committed suicide because the experience under Spanish rule, under Colombian rule, was so terrible. All right. So what did he discover? Or I should say, what did the Europeans discover when they came to America? Well, there are so many different populations in North and South America that it is very hard to describe just simply. I know a lot of people are like, oh, they were hunter-gatherers, foragers. They led this communal lifestyle with nature, and that's to a certain extent true for some people, right? But we've got 2 continents, and there's a lot to unpack here. So the first is they span this wide spectrum from hunter-gatherers who truly are communing with nature to communing with nature and just gathering and hunting. There's also a huge number of Amerindians who practice some amount of agriculture. They would often plant sweet potatoes or corn in one place and then come back, right? They would keep a nomadic lifestyle, visit one place, plant, and then they'd come back in harvest season. But in between, they'd be hunting and foraging and other things. So they'd have this pretty broad territory. They were not setting down roots. Maybe they would do that in the winter and kind of they'd harvest the crops that they planted in the spring, set down with their surplus. But it's definitely not a monochrome Amerindian experience of hunter-gathering or just agriculture. There were massive agricultural civilizations. So you had the Mississippi River civilization, which was incredibly populous, the most populous of North America, that actually died out before any Europeans came into contact with them. And I'll get into why in just a second. But you also have the famous civilizations of the Aztecs in Mesoamerica, modern day Mexico. And you also have the Incans, which live along the Andes on the western part of South America. So let's see, I'm going to move to another map. All right, so I know this is probably pretty glossy. I hope you can at least see the outline of the Americas, or at least know what they look like, right? So we have Mesoamerica, this is Guatemala, and especially Mexico. This is where the Aztecs were. The Incans lived all throughout the western edge of South America and subsisted mostly on potatoes, whereas the Aztecs subsisted mostly on corn. But these were large, agriculturally intensive civilizations, very much like what you would see in the old world. So when I say the old world, I refer to Eurasia, Europe, Asia, Africa, etc. And what's important to note is that for most of human history, the difference of a few thousand years is not a big deal, right? If you compare humans in 100,000 BC versus 98,000 BC, very little difference across the globe, right? But things really start to ramp up with agriculture. That's really the beginning of exponential evolution of civilizations. So when you have civilizations in the old world, say in Mesopotamia or the Indus River Valley or East Asia, that discover agriculture, like farming rice and wheat and barley, the difference of a few thousand years in the old world versus the new world civilizations is going to be tremendous. So the Aztecs were a very sophisticated, very complex civilization who were comparable to maybe the Mesopotamian civilizations of 2000 BC. Now it's hard to compare them directly because it's much more difficult to find workable metals in the New World. And so the Aztecs, despite being very sophisticated, only had stone. They were still in the Stone Age, despite having a population of 30 million people in an incredibly complex society. So there's also there's very little metal production. There's no gunpowder, right? This is partially due to the lack of resources and also just due to the technological being technologically behind for the New World peoples versus the Old World peoples. An important thing to note is that you have here a north-south axis, right? Which means that in the same, if you compare it to Eurasia, where you can go from Portugal on the one hand to China on the other, all across the same latitude, that means that the climate is going to be relatively similar, at least insofar that you can trade crops from one place to another, and you're able to kind of globalize much more easily in Eurasia than you are in North and South America, right? You cannot take crops from modern day Kansas and bring them down to Central America. It's going to be much harder. There's also a tremendous desert here, mountain ranges, etc. It's going to make trade much more difficult to do. So the societies of the New World are far less globalized than they are in Eurasia. Finally, compounding this there's almost no domesticated animals in the New World, right? So in the Old World, we famously have chickens, cows, sheep, horses, goats. Just tons. I think there's like 27 animals that we've domesticated coming from the Old World. In the New World, it's dogs, man's best friend, right? The first animal to be domesticated. We have llamas, which are fine, but they're not actually great pack animals. They're fairly weak, especially compared to oxen or horses. And we have guinea pigs, which are really good for nothing but sticking on a stick and roasting them and eating them at a football game. So with the lack of domesticated animals, you actually have a much smaller disease pool. A lot of diseases that we have today come from animals. They hop over the human barrier, the species barrier. This is what happened, of course, with COVID-19. Someone's just trying to eat bat soup, and they instead end up starting a global pandemic. Um, so the proximity of old world peoples to cows and sheep and goats and pigs, and just like sleeping near them or living with them, makes them far more exposed to a number of diseases, which means the diversity of diseases in the old world is far greater than that in the new world. So that means when Europeans show up, they are introducing a wide array of diseases to Native American people who have no experience with these before. Now, while you have diseases like the Black Death or smallpox wiping out a large number of Eurasians every year, it's nowhere near the lethality that you see in the 100 years after Columbus. There's estimates between 50 and 100 million people living in North and South America in 1491. 100 years later, that is down to between 1 and 5 million people. And this mortality rate of 90 to 95% is almost unheard of anywhere else in history. It's equivalent to being a Jew living in Poland during the Second World War, in that there is just a murderous annihilation that kills almost every single person there. And this is one of the major, if not the single biggest reason that the Spanish and other Europeans are able to conquer and rule the Americas, because the pre-existing institutions and cultures have been wiped out, and they are able to rebuild everything. There's no population to rebel against them in 1550 or 1600 or 1650. They've been destroyed. So the Spanish are really able to control, to dominate, and to intermix and interbreed with the native peoples to create a completely new civilization and a new people that have very few indigenous roots. That's not to say there aren't indigenous people who remain. There are indigenous people throughout the Americas, but their numbers are so diminished from what they were before contact. So that's the background of European colonization. And you guys are going to explore who these peoples were, who lived in the Americas before Europeans showed up, and also the explorers, what they did, who they were, what they were looking for. Thank you.